Hi, I'm Pete Mather. I'm the Senior Associate Editor for the Journal of College and Character, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about and set up a conversation we're going to be having at the upcoming NASPA conference in LA in March. We're going to be doing a session called Promoting Civic Learning in the Journal of College and Character, and with me are two experts in this area. First, Nancy Thomas, who recently published an article in our journal. The article is called Conceptualizing and Assessing Campus Climates for Political Learning and Engagement in Democracy. It's in our fall 2018 edition of the journal. And then Stephanie King is also with us, who works on some NASPA initiatives. So I'll say a little bit more about each of them and then give them an opportunity to talk a little bit about their work and how it relates to the session we're going to be doing in March. So first, Nancy Thomas has had long-time engagement in these issues of political learning, civic engagement. She directs the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University, and she has a distinguished pedigree academically. She holds a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a law degree from Case Western Reserve School of Law. She has been involved in a lot of research and activities around issues like college student civic learning and participation in democracy, campus climates for political engagement, and political equity and inclusion, campus free speech, which of course is a hot topic right now for NASPA members. And then Stephanie King is the Director for Civic Engagement and Knowledge Community Initiatives at NASPA. And she has a background in student affairs, has worked in a number of functional areas, and then moved into the NASPA office. And she has done publication in these same areas as well. So we're very pleased to have both of these presenters with us in March and today for our video blog. So I'm going to start with just a question for both of you. And Stephanie, maybe you can start a little bit by talking about what is political learning and democratic engagement. What do you mean by that? And what are the ultimate outcomes that should come from that?
Thank you, Pete. It's my pleasure to be with you and Nancy today to talk a little bit more about NASPA's commitment to civic learning and democratic engagement and how our work ties with our partners, such as the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at the Jonathan M. Tisch College for Civic Life at Tufts University. So first and foremost, when we at NASPA use the terminology of civic learning and democratic engagement, more commonly referred to as CLDE, we mean the education of our students for engaged citizenship or citizenry through democratic participation in their communities, respect and appreciation of diversity, and applied learning and social responsibility. I'll defer to Nancy in a moment to talk a little bit more about political learning, as we default to IDHE's terminology, as they are the experts in this space when we think about political learning and engagement. But one of our desired outcomes when we talk about civic learning and democratic engagement is by way of civic participation. And in by civic participation, we mean an individual or group activity which addresses issues of public concern, allowing citizens to act together for the common good or for a common community goal. For us, one of those outcomes would be to actualize a thriving democracy in which each person has an opportunity to collectively co-create what this democracy is. This means to conceptualize democratic engagement as a central practice in everyday life and relationships, not a particular set of activities undertaken on special occasions, such as days of service, Constitution Day, during an election, and so forth. What we're really hoping is to evoke John Dewey's framing of democracy as a way of life that must be enacted anew in every generation, in every year and day, in the living relations of person to person, and all social forms and institutions. By enacting John Dewey's framing of democracy, this wave of thinking affords every person with experiences and expectations for full participation, again, not just in elections, but in dialogue, problem solving, organizing, and the creation of new laws, policies, and social resources for their communities, nation, and the world. So rather than conceptualizing civics as confined in particular activities like voting or providing voluntary service, Our goal is for Americans to be empowered to build democratic relationships and to understand themselves to be potential civic co-creators in their workspaces, on their campuses, and in everyday interactions in our meaningful lives. These aspirations are at the forefront for what it could look like to have full civic participation through actualizing effective political learning.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And I guess one thing I pull out of that is that so often we hear kind of on the national stage about voter participation and voter engagement. Of course, that's just a part of this, but it's a much broader piece that's, you know, a lot of areas of importance for and ways in which people to be involved and students to be involved and to cultivate kind of future engagement during their college years. So Nancy, would you like to build on what Stephanie said?
Sure. I think NASPA has a pretty comprehensive definition, and what Stephanie said, I think, captures it all. It's a movement that has had many phases. It really started back in the 70s and 80s as a lot about volunteerism. Then it moved into a phase of being more about community engagement. The early launch of all these civic centers on campuses was often funded by HUD, which was Housing and Urban Development, because there was a sense that colleges and universities needed to be better neighbors. They needed to be better in the local communities. And so the movement got defined often by what people were doing, as opposed to what we might identify as the desired outcomes of it. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is to get people to be thinking about, well, okay, so you do community engagement, you do volunteerism, you do service learning, you do Constitution Day. What are you doing it for? Where are you trying to go with it? And so at least in my office, we have a desired outcome that we're always steering the ship toward. And that is a sort of an aspirational view of democracy, one that is participatory, where everyday citizens are actively involved and they are vigilant and they are informed, which is another component to a strong democracy, an educated and informed citizenry. We also include in a definition of an aspirational strong democracy a strong equity agenda, a sort of a set of principles that are guiding what we're doing. A lot of people would say, well, what about justice and what about freedom? Those are all part of it. So we're in our democracy in the United States, we are driven by a set of principles, democratic principles that in theory guide our government, but also how we interact together and make our communities strong, which then brings me to the last point, which is we do want a transparent, accountable government and governance system. And I think so often the civic movement has kind of left that piece behind. And that's one of the pieces that I'm trying to get people to be thinking about is if you participate, you are participating usually to make some progress, to move the needle on policy. And that's often a government or a governance issue. So we need to be holding our elected officials accountable, and we need to have fair and accessible voting systems. We need to have a judiciary that is fair and unbiased, and so on and so forth. So it's a big agenda if you think about the civic movement the way we do it. You went into the dark. Okay, Pete's back from the dark side. Anyway, so our definition of democracy includes those four components. It's participatory, it's just and equitable, it's educated and informed, and it's effectively governed.
Great, thank you so much. And one thing I think about, that takes me to a couple of different places, but one is personal agency and the sense that people have personal agency and mattering in this kind of context. And so look forward to hearing more about that and the ways to actualize that in our conversation in March. And Nancy, in your article in the JCC, you highlighted a number of conditions and factors that are at play in fostering democratic engagement. And we don't have time to take a deep dive into each of those, but I'd like to ask you to address a couple of the contemporary dynamics embedded in the framework that you provided. One of the issues you mentioned is the tolerance for and approaches to dealing with conflict. And I hear from our students at Ohio University, where I work, that this is one of the most significant issues affecting them, how they deal with differences and conflict. And could you talk about what you saw at the institutions in your study that seemed to be kind of doing this right, you know, creating forums and ways in which people can dialogue with each other, and then how institutional leaders might promote environments to ensure free and open speech, and then also at the same time a sense of psychological safety, particularly of those students who come from marginalized and underrepresented populations. So how can institutional leaders promote these kind of environments? Yeah. Nancy, would you like to take that?
Sure. So we are, you know, you can't do civic engagement work on a college campus and avoid the political climate, the political context for it. And the sad truth, and this is a fact, it's not my opinion, is that Americans are very polarized. They are moving into corners where they want to believe themselves, or there are certain polls that are coming out about how Americans view people from the other political party. We have gotten into a place where it's just so darn hard to talk to each other. And what that means is that campus has become a little bit skittish about it. And you can see it in the classroom, and you can see it in co-curricular programming, in dormitories, and so forth. And what we did is we went to about 10 campuses. We went to 10 campuses. We've subsequently been working with 13 more to study their climates for political learning and engagement. And we had learned a lot about conflict in discourse and how important it is for colleges and universities to help students understand how to talk to each other, how to listen with respect, how to keep an open mind, how to take perspectives from people that maybe they don't agree with, to respect dissenting opinions, to learn to find common ground and even, dare I say, collaborate. So these are some of the things that we think will make a big difference. One of the findings in our study was that campuses with very high levels of political engagement, which we measured by voting rates, that was our proxy, using voting as a proxy for political interests. One of the actual number one finding had to do with political discussion. The more political discussions were in the student experience, the more likely they were to participate in the electoral process. So we're still doing research on that front, but it's certainly backed up by other literature, and I'm very confident in that finding. So we want people to talk politics everywhere, often, and well.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. And Stephanie, just anything you'd like to add to those comments?
Yeah. I think I would echo Nancy's sentiments in that we're noticing with college campuses, as NASPA has a representative sample, it's about 2,100 institutions right now, that there is an automatic polarized feeling when individuals mention the ideal of politics or having conversation across differences. It's really hard for our students today to feel comfortable to engage, to be present as their full selves, and to also be able to reach common ground, whatever that might be on whichever issue. Furthermore, we're finding for the administrators and faculty that are working with these students, they too are in need of some preparatory work to be able to enact this skill themselves. So it's really hard for us to be asking this of our students when our administrators and our faculty aren't able to do it themselves. Therefore, NASPA's really been engaging in trying to find opportunities to engage practitioners and spaces for dialogue and deliberation where multiple ideals can be presented, whether it's on a political front or something that's deemed a wicked problem for that campus, i.e. parking, residential buildings, environmental stewardship, whatever the it factor might be, but finding those opportunities for there to be collaborative learning spaces so we can reach decisions in higher education that are for the better of the good and not for the better of an individual person. So like Nancy's findings, we too see that there's a need for our campuses to continue to engage, and those that are willing to engage through programs like the NASPA Lead Initiative, the Voter Friendly Campus Program, and so forth, that we're able to find these outlying experiences that show a heightened inclination that folks that are willing to engage and have the skills are able to do so in a more intentional format.
Yeah, I think it goes back. Pete, to your comment about participation and agency. You know, if people are afraid to talk to each other, they are afraid to participate. And we cannot cultivate a generation of people, citizens, not used in the legal term, but we can't cultivate that generation of active people who are going to be responsible for communities and for our nation if they can't talk to each other. It's such a simple concept, and yet, you know, we do a lot of work with faculty, and it is hard to have these conversations in the classroom. There is a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of being videotaped and then having your videotape being blasted out of context, you know, an excerpt of it blasted out of context all over the internet. I mean, these are very difficult times to have, unfortunately, the conversations that we need now more than ever.
Great, thank you. And I just want to highlight something that that you said and Stephanie said too. This is not just a student project, right? It's a campus-wide project. And certainly we know that the goal of these outcome goals of positive engagement are things that that faculty can learn, that student affairs professionals can learn, that other institutional leaders can learn, as well as students. So we're on this journey together. So I guess I'd like to kind of provide an opportunity for us to close here with anything else, any surprising findings, anything else you'd like to add to sort of whet the appetite for the people who are watching the blog as we prepare to have a deeper and more extended conversation in March.
What I might add for folks that might be surprising, and I borrowed this language from Nancy in a previous conversation that we've had, is to think of elections more as an outcome, that they're not the end all be all, that we're not striving in terms of political learning and civic participation for folks to turn out and vote. Yes, that's important. Yes, I'm excited when folks do so. But it's much more about how do we continue that political landscape and learning beyond that moment in time that's an election. And the surprising thing for us is that most folks really think that the election numbers are the end all be all. And really we need to get folks thinking about community, and I would say with a capital C, that it's larger than just that moment in time. It's thinking about our budgetary practices. Where do our dollars go? What do our students need to learn? What are the basic skills that we need to be enacting as humans to be able to create a world that we strive as a thriving democracy? So I'd say that's a surprising thing for me.
Great. Nancy?
Well, I have a couple of things. One is I want to second what Stephanie just said. It's so important that we not look at elections as episodic. They are a learning opportunity. There are many political issues that come up. Talk about an opportunity to bring together people with different perspectives to talk about the difficult problems that we face as a society and what are the policy implications. And people are afraid to do that because they are interchanging the words political and partisan. That's an enormous mistake. Partisan and political are not interchangeable terms. You can be political, and frankly, we could do a whole other blog on this, but higher education, learning, it's all political. But you don't need to be partisan if you are political, and taking sides on issues is not partisan. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, if I take this side, then I'm being partisan. That is not true. Partisan means you align with a party or a candidate. You can't do that, but you can take sides on issues. And a lot of times our public scholarship in higher education supports taking sides. So I think that we've got to get over that fear, that reticence of talking politics. One of the surprising findings for us that I think is squarely in the wheelhouse of student affairs has to do with student social cohesion, a sense of well-being, student-faculty relationships, faculty and student relationships with people on campus. You know, it's one thing to just say, oh, go out and talk politics, just do it, right? Well, you can't do it without some background work. So you have to build relationships first. And if students are feeling disconnected, if they feel disconnected from the class that they're in, the people in their classroom, if they feel disconnected from people in their dormitories, if they don't have anybody to eat with, if they can't find anybody on campus who can write a recommendation for them for a job, that's a serious problem. That's a problem of student well-being and student interconnectivity. And that is an important ingredient that needs to be established before you can have an expectation of, oh, we're going to talk controversy now. So that is, I think, something that student affairs focuses on and needs to do more on. I'm not the only one in the country who's talking about that, but I think our connecting it with political agency and participation was a bit surprising. We certainly didn't expect it from our research, and yet it came out loud and clear.
I was having trouble unmuting. But yeah, well, thank you so much. And one thing, I mean, it strikes me that, you know, many student affairs professionals, people who have been involved in NASPA for a long time, have been interested in these things. But one thing is that strikes me is the way that these issues connect with areas that are so and part of the common discourse in student affairs: identity, community, right? And those two areas, how does identity play into this? And I think you referred to that a little bit, Nancy, and then also community. You know, we are whole communities and working with these issues together. And so for our student affairs colleagues who are going to be at NASPA, I think these issues touch and connect with so many other areas of interest and engagement of our professionals and our students. Well, this has, I think, been a great conversation, a starting point, a kickoff for our. I appreciate both the talents and energy and interests that you two bring into the conversation, and look forward to being with you all in March in Los Angeles.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Stephanie. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.